As it turns out, Prime Minister Modi is about to arrive in New York, and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is already here in New York. But it appears that the two leaders will not be meeting. So we've done what the two governments have not done and got India and Pakistan on one platform. And we will talk about terror and about whether we can be united in this war against terror. I think that's our theme. We're going to keep it flexible, so we're not going to have long keynote speeches. We're just going to look at specific issues and ask our guests to address them. And I'm going to start with the contentious issue that many people in India, and I think Mr. Ram Madhav alluded to it, that even today the Indian and Pakistani states have a very different view of terror and who is a terrorist. And I want Mr. Haqqani to address what you might have heard the earlier speaker suggest, that you cannot have different rules for terror. You cannot say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Do you believe that in the new world in 2014 that has changed and Islamabad has a similar view to the war against terror as New Delhi does?
Rajdeep, first of all, let's be very clear that the people of Pakistan and the establishment of Pakistan are two different things. The people of Pakistan are themselves suffering on account of terrorism. And the reason for that is simple. Any state that has used terrorism historically has always ended up being consumed by that terrorism itself. We are seeing that in the Middle East right now. There was a time when Syria was considered one of the state sponsors of terrorism because it wanted to sponsor terrorism against Israel. But then the terrorists have now rebounded and they have put the state of Syria in jeopardy. So if you ask your question slightly differently and say, are the people of Pakistan now coming round to understanding and accepting the fact that no grievance in the world, no dispute in the world justifies the use of terrorism as a tactic, and that terrorism will always come and rebound to its sponsors? Then yes, that is now becoming a widespread position among the people of Pakistan. Now comes the question of the Pakistani establishment. Unfortunately, you started off by describing me as a friend of India. Let me say that I am trying to follow in the footsteps or follow in the tradition of Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who on the eve of partition said that the future that he looks at about India-Pakistan relations is for the two countries to live side by side like the United States and Canada, with open borders, with shared history, with a shared language, and many things common between the two, and with huge amounts of trade. So I basically look at that future for Pakistan and India. We are not there yet, but a lot more Pakistanis now realize that the future growth, development, and sustainability of Pakistan depends on good relations with India. The Pakistani establishment is different. They have persuaded themselves that India is an eternal enemy. And as long as India is an eternal enemy, and Pakistan cannot have conventional military parity with India, then sub-conventional capability, they think, gives them an advantage. I don't. Many Pakistanis don't. I am sure Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif doesn't. President Asif Ali Zardari certainly didn't. But the Pakistani establishment has yet to make the final decision that can there be good Taliban and bad Taliban, and good terrorists and bad terrorists, or are all terrorists bad? I want, as a Pakistani, for my state, my establishment, to take the decision once and for all, for the sake of Pakistan, not for India, not for America, not... Now, it is becoming less and less sustainable to make distinctions. And we are now going to see a stage where the internal battle in Pakistan will become more intense between those who have a vision of Pakistan in mind that will incorporate Pakistan with the rest of the world, and those who do not mind Pakistan becoming isolated. Unfortunately, this struggle is going to be slightly protracted, and it's not going to be easily resolved because neither side is going to relent easily. So right now, the short answer, the Pakistani people certainly more aware of the perils of terrorism, and the Pakistani establishment still making distinction between the Taliban who attacked the Pakistan army and Hafiz Saeed, whom they consider a friend. As far as I'm concerned, people like Hafiz Saeed belong in a prison cell, not on television in Pakistan.
Those are strong words. I wish you could say them in Islamabad with the same fervor that you've said them in New York.
Rajdeep, actually, I have said them in Islamabad, which is why I am in Washington, D.C. right now.
I take your point, and I'll come back to that. But before I come to you, Mr. Tharoor, let me get Mr. Sandhu, because you've heard Mr. Haqqani make this distinction, and he's being very honest and candid in saying that he believes that a majority of Pakistani citizens do not make the distinction between good Taliban, bad Taliban, good terrorist, bad terrorist. But the Pakistani state is still caught in a trap. How do you respond to that when he says that? Does that only confirm your fears that it is not possible to have this united war against terror in the neighborhood, in South Asia?
Well, let me first say that at the formal level, there is no congruence in terms of understanding the threat of terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. We have very, very few engagements at the formal level with the government of Pakistan with regard to terrorism. They had a couple of Home Secretary level talks, but those have been very flaky and nothing substantial has emerged. I accept the point that Mr. Haqqani made that the people of Pakistan dread terror as much as anybody else. But it's also a fact that notwithstanding this perception at the popular level, there is a very strong element within the Pakistan system that not only allows latitude on the one side to people like Hafiz Saeed to sort of pour out, to spew out venom on a regular basis. There is active support of terrorism in terms of permitting them to gather funds, in terms of allowing them to recruit, in terms of allowing them to maintain terrorist training camps, and most importantly, in terms of facilitating their clandestine entries across the line of control into our territory. So it's a fact we have to live with. We have to live with the duality of this reality. That on the one side, you have a government which is unable to come out with any degree of emphasis against terrorism, and on the other side, you have an active machine quite vigorously aiding the terrorists who can cause harm to India. And it's not just that they're aiding terrorists who are causing harm to India. In the most recent dimension, I think there's been recreation of Lashkar facilities, for example, in the eastern provinces, Kunnad and Nuristan provinces of Afghanistan. And Lashkar is reaching out into Afghanistan. They've attacked us more than once in Kabul. And most recently, they went out as far afield as Herat, which is on the Iran border, to hit our interests. So there is this monster which has to be dealt with. And I'm sure the people of Pakistan realize that very, very decisive steps are needed. But I don't think their opinion counts.
Okay. You're again being very plain speaking there. Shashi Tharoor, the dualism exists. The dualism exists between the Pakistani state and the people. The dualism exists in views on terror. So how do you then find a solution wherein you know the enemy, you know that the Lashkar is the enemy, you know where they are, and yet it's almost impossible in the subcontinent to conceive of a time where maybe India could pursue the right of hot pursuit, as possibly Israel does today or the United States would do. India can't do that. India can't go across the border and bomb the camps. We know where the camps are. What then is the solution? I mean, are we going to be seen as a permanently soft state, unable to exercise our national interests?
No. I think that a couple of things to be said right away. First of all, there is a genuine challenge here in terms of policy making, because there is no question that we understand, as Nechal was pretty much clearly implying, that there are elements within that senior establishment, not so much in Islamabad perhaps as in Rawalpindi, in GHQ, who are consciously using terrorism as an instrument of their policy. And their policy is not merely to destabilize India and Pakistan. It is also to shore up their own position within Pakistan. Because after all, continued instability, continued hostility on the borders is what guarantees them the disproportionate share of their own national budget and their own country's GDP. The Pakistani army actually disposes of a larger percentage of the country's GDP than any army anywhere in the world. So there is no question that it's in their interest to ensure that this continues on both sides. Now, given that, is there an easy solution? I mean, obviously hot pursuit and so on is fantasy. It is almost foolish, because it would simply rally those who are currently not with them behind them, because there's nothing better to get everyone under the flag than another country attacking you. I mean, if the moment India drops bombs, the peace constituency in Pakistan will disappear. So, from our point of view, that would not be a sensible option to exercise. This is why the UPA government particularly favored various forms of diplomatic containment. That is to ensure that the Pakistani government had a stake in working with the military to ensure that at least the use of this tactic was minimized. I mean, we haven't had a major attack since 26/11. Some would talk about the German bakery in Pune the following year, but that's pretty much the last one that...
No, we've had, as Mr. Sandhu said, we've had our consulates being attacked as far as Herat.
Yes, well, Kabul and Herat is a difference. I'm talking within India. So, I mean, the tragedy is an attack on our embassy in Kabul would not prompt any Indian government to necessarily even contemplate the kind of option you're implying. Another 26/11 in India would make rejection of such an option politically impossible. So that's the kind of stake that both sides have to understand. Let's face also one more thing, that as far as I mean, I've said this before and probably on your show, but forgive me for repeating it, we have to accept in India that whereas in our country, the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And because the army is calling the shots there and is dominating the state apparatus, either formally once they conduct coups, or informally when they are not officially in power, but are drawing the red lines within which an elected civilian government can function. And the moment those red lines are transgressed, the civilian government knows its number is up. The real problem is also compounded by the fact that our elected civilian government can only talk to their elected civilian government. Our military talks to their military, and I'm sure Nachal can tell us whether there's any dialogue at more informal levels amongst other actors in both countries. He seems to be implying not much. But whatever it may be, these channels will have to be used constructively to ensure that even if the Pakistanis let their government know, the military lets their government know that they have this option, and they know that we know that they have this option, that they don't exercise this option.
How do you tackle the global jihadi now?
Look, the global jihadi, of course, needs to be deprived of safe havens, training facilities, organizing facilities, because let us be honest, there have been other occasions in the world when people have tried to change the world through terrorism. There are historic examples. They never controlled territories sufficiently strongly to be able to make them safe havens. And whenever there have been states that have sponsored terrorism, the rest of the world has tried to isolate them. And that is the manner in which the world has dealt with state-sponsored terrorism. So the global jihadi is a phenomenon. One needs to counter the ideology. I think that both India and Pakistan have an interest in countering the ideology of global jihad. So do all of the Middle Eastern countries. And there can be a grand international coalition. But unfortunately, the role of certain states, which parses the definition of terrorist, is not going to make it easy for a grand global coalition against terrorism. After 9/11, there was an attempt to do that. There is an attempt to do that now after the rise of ISIL. But eventually, this will have to be a much longer war, and it won't just have to be a war. It will have to be an ideological war. And while I have the mic, let me just make one little observation. Anybody who thinks that we were on the cusp of an agreement, but just because one individual left his position, that agreement was not possible, is deluding himself. If the army had really come on board with Musharraf's agreement or put up a deal with India, then after he left, General Kiani would have told the civilian government, go ahead and sign this agreement with our blessing. They did not, which is the reason why I say be very, very skeptical of talks that look like being on the verge of agreement and do not let you come to the agreement. That basically is usually a way of long-term engagement. It's very convenient that General Musharraf disappears, and if the file does exist in the GHQ, which I'm sure it does, according to you, then they should have moved forward. The fact that they didn't move forward is because of the reasons that Shashi and I listed out in the beginning. Right. Interests, desire to control Pakistan a certain way, and an obsession with what is known as the ideology of Pakistan instead of focusing on the prosperity of Pakistan and the people of Pakistan.
Okay. I know that your troubles with General Musharraf are far from over, so I can see where you're coming from, and you still remain skeptical of Musharraf. But let's get a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, the lady there. Yes, ma'am.
This is a question for Mr. Sandhu. The previous moderator mentioned that the BJP government is a macho government, which implied, of course, that the previous government was, very emasculated, effete, weak, spineless government. And for the last 65 years, the government either looked the other way or actively encouraged terrorism. And Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who was part of that particular government, said India cannot go into Pakistan and take action. But you are the only person who has actual experience with intelligence, whereas the rest are just speakers. So I would like to know your view on the matter.
Your view about whether the BJP is going to change that?
Yes, can they do it, and will they just keep talking? Because you're the person who actually has worked in the field of intelligence, whereas the rest of them have not. So you, as a person in that particular field and as a specialist, is the BJP in a position to do so, and will they do so? What do you think?
Let me just say that I've been in this business since the early 80s. I've seen governments of different parties. There's been consistency in the way in which we've approached terrorism, and there's been a steady incremental in the way in which we've handled it. I don't see the new government doing anything very, very different, such as crossing borders and so on, because that's not what you can do in this day and age.
Because now you have an intelligence bureau chief who's the national security advisor. I mean, yes, I've often wondered whether that means that we could finally take out a Dawood Ibrahim who's apparently sitting in Karachi. We know exactly where he's sitting.
The issue is never taking somebody out. The issue is dealing with the morning after. And that's really the issue in this case. This is an oversimplification, and very frankly, look.
But certain countries do. Certain countries do.
Yes, but let's be honest. Let us try and visualize a situation in which Syria, for example, under Hafiz al-Assad, had nuclear weapons. Do you think Israel would have been able to act the way it did with Syria? So let us be realistic. There are constraints. One is not saying that those constraints are desirable, but they are the reality. And I very frankly get a little upset with all of us. We are part of the same DNA. We are all part of the South Asian milieu of subcontinent. We all have this tendency for the rhetorical flourish. We like talking about usko ulta latka denge, usko seedha kar denge. But the truth is that these are complex issues. There are reasons why previous Indian governments, for whom I hold no brief, that they haven't done certain things, and I think it is good that they haven't, because we do not want to climb the escalatory ladder. We want to resolve these issues, but we do not want our region, our world, to actually go up in flames.
One final question. Yes, Mr. Sareshwala, you had a question here.
No, actually, I would just like to comment what Mr. Sandhu said about radicalization of Muslims in India. I would differ, because I have been associated with Muslim communities, and most which you named, Jamaat-e-Islami, SIM and all that. In India, there is absolutely no radicalization. I mean, if you, out of 20 million, if 1,500 or 2,000 take up something like IM, I think this does not make any case. It is not in the DNA of Indian Muslims to have any, forget about being extreme, they cannot even have that fundamentalistic view about religion. Islam in India is very moderate. So I also, till I didn't go to USA and UK in '95, I didn't know what extreme Islam is.
Right.
So that Islam which we have in India is absolutely moderate. And I have not yet, in my life of 30 years since I've been out, I have not found any IM guy or somebody who has these kind of views. So they must be 1,500, 2,000, but you cannot make case out of that. So I just wanted to make that
I think that's
comment.
a strong point to make. I'm going to end with you, Shashi, as a final word. Do you believe that we will come back to this very forum 10 years from now and be perhaps still stuck in this quagmire of either blame game or, or still being accusatory? Do you really believe that India and Pakistan are capable of rising above this, above themselves almost, and finding a way forward? Are you hopeful about the future or pessimistic? Because many in America believe Pakistan remains the most dangerous place in the world. And it will be impossible, it will become even more difficult to deal with an unstable Pakistan in the future.
Look, I'm a chronic optimist. I've been accused rightly of that in many contexts. But I think that ultimately this can only change if the Pakistani military establishment perceives it to be in its self-interest for change to come. Now, there are various ways in which that might occur. I mean, one of the problems right now is that they continue to get an enormous amount of international support because of their fight against one kind of terrorism. So the Americans are pumping money into them in order to fight the so-called Pakistani Taliban, while they continue to encourage the other Taliban that attacks us and attacks Afghanistan. I mean, the notion that the terrorists who attacked the Marriott in Islamabad are bad, but the ones who attacked the Taj in Mumbai are good, has not completely left significant elements of the Pakistani military establishment. But if, for example, some of that funding starts drying up, if the world's stake in Afghanistan and India increases to a point where they actually start producing powerful disincentives for this sort of action, if the space within civic society in Pakistan enlarges to a point where the constituency for relations with India becomes more irresistible than it now is, there's so many big ifs, then yes, I think we can see some movement, because the Pakistani military will want, of course, a certain place in their own society, but they won't want to jeopardize that place by being completely out of sync with the rest of their society. These are straws in the wind. These are one is clutching at, but it's the best we can hope for. 10 years ago, if you had asked the question, would we be back in 10 years saying the same things, we wouldn't have said anything very different. I mean, I actually came across a couple of things I wrote in 2007, 2008, and it was before 26/11. I realized that, one is saying precisely the same thing since. So I don't really believe right now that we have enough elements for grounding a conclusion that things will be different in 10 years. But we have to keep chipping away at it, and that's what our government did for 10 years. How close we came is a matter of dispute. Certainly the perception in Pakistan is that we didn't come very close. But I know the Prime Minister acted with tremendous good faith. He really, really believed in this. It didn't work out, not for lack of effort on our part. We'll continue chipping away with it, but above all, we'll keep India safe. And I'm sure that the new government, as Mr. Sandhu said, the new government will not be doing anything very different. We've seen governments of 4 different political persuasions in the time that he's been in intelligence. And we've basically seen a pretty consistent line. So I think we can expect some continuity with the present government also.
Okay. On that note, which is only partly hopeful, I'm afraid, because it suggests that we may well be back here in New York in a few years' time, perhaps looking at it as a zero-sum game, which would be worrying. Let's still hope that there can be more imaginative solutions in the war against terror. Shashi Tharoor, Hussain Haqqani, Nishchal Sandhu, thank you very much, and to the audience, thank you very much.